Greetings. I wanted to make a quick addendum to my previous video, which was in reply to Pastor Kelly Richardson regarding the pews at the First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia. Recall that in Pastor Richardson's video, he felt it was important to focus on the sanctuary of that church, in particular on the stained glass windows in the sanctuary, which depicted 6 previous pastors. And he even chastised Vocab Malone and I guess tacitly myself for not touching on the fact that those stained glass windows are organized from right to left. Here, take a look at this.
Here's the actual video.
I want to say Shalom. I'm here at the First African Baptist Church here down in Savannah, Georgia. This is my uncle right here, Pastor James Wesley Carr. He pastored this church back in 1907. So just wanted to show you guys here some history here. So this is the church that have ancient Hebraic writings here. But I just want to give you a little history that you won't see in your history books. But this is the actual sanctuary here. So I'm gonna do like a panoramic view so you can kind of see here. So you'll see all the founders up here. I'm gonna step back so you can see a bigger picture of the sanctuary, right? You can see it behind me, right? I want y'all to pay attention to that. The pictures are listed just like ancient Hebrew, reads from right to left. So the first pastor, which is his name is Reverend Andrew Bryan, 1812. Oh, you see how it is? It goes from right to left, right to left.
Notice how they completely left out me explaining the arrangements of each pastor on the stained glass picture that's arranged according to how the Hebrew language is read, from right to left.
What's interesting about that clip is the way Pastor Richardson says right to left while pointing right and left with his finger, and then he lowers his hand and points right and left again while saying right to left, giving the impression that the images of these different pastors are organized chronologically in different rows.
You see how it is? It goes from right to left, right to left.
The reality, however, is that the stained glass windows are not organized chronologically in rows, rather they're organized chronologically in columns. And yes, the columns are organized right to left, but the individual columns themselves are organized chronologically from top to bottom. Well, since Pastor Richardson wanted to emphasize the sanctuary of the church, in this video I'd like to focus a bit more on that sanctuary and the stained glass windows therein. So let's take a look at these depictions. The first one depicted is Andrew Bryan, and the years given are 1788 to 1812. And then the chronology moves downward, not to the left, but downward, at which point the second person depicted is Andrew Marshall, with the years given as 1812 to 1856. The third person in the chronology is William Campbell, with the years given 1857 to 1877. Having reached the bottom of the first column, now we can move to the left to the second column and begin again at the top. At the top, the fourth person listed is George Gibbons, 1878 to 1884. And once again, from there, the chronology moves downward. And the fifth person depicted is Emmanuel King Love, 1885 to 1900. And finally, the sixth person depicted is the distant relative of Pastor Richardson, James Wesley Carr, 1901 to 1907. In a moment, I'd like to take a closer look at that stained glass window depicting James Wesley Carr, but before doing so, I want to reiterate a point about this collection of depictions and the ordering of their chronology. Recall again that Pastor Richardson says the depictions go from right to left.
It goes from right to left, right to left.
However, forgive me, but I would have to say that description is a bit misleading in terms of what it leaves out. The reality is that initially they go downward, not horizontally, but rather vertically from top to bottom. Then it goes upward back to the top of the next column. And then from there, once again, it goes downward. If we are going to liken this arrangement to a written script, we wouldn't liken it so much to the Hebrew script. Rather, we would liken it to traditional Chinese or traditional Tategaki Japanese, where the text is written from vertically from top to bottom in columns that move from right to left. Moreover, even if one insists on making a big deal about the columns going from right to left, it's still worth noting that Hebrew isn't the only language that's written from right to left. And by the way, you know what else is written from right to left? Arabic. And with that in mind, I'd like to once again note that I presented a hypothetical case for Arabic rather than Hebrew appearing in those pews. And while I don't actually believe that Arabic appears there, I would nonetheless honestly say that I think the case I made for Arabic is stronger than any case that's been made by proponents of the view that Hebrew appears in those pews. Whatever the case, as I noted a moment ago, now I'd like to take a closer look at that portion of the stained glass windows which depicts James Wesley Carr. What I'd like to focus on are the markings within that golden circle, that inner golden circle. In particular, I'd like to look at the markings at the bottom of that circle. Now, of course, I realize that in reality that's English, reading 1901, Reverend J.W. Carr, Doctor of Divinity, 1907. However, for a fun little thought experiment, let's just refer to them as the markings, and let's see if a case can be made for Hebrew appearing amongst those markings. Before we begin, however, first note that in Pastor Kelly Richardson's methodology, one isn't required to demonstrate the presence of words, much less phrases. Rather, it's sufficient only to note that portions of the markings resemble mere single letters from the Hebrew script.
Well, I can identify some of the letters, put it that way. I'm not going to say I know the words. I can identify some of the letters.
So let's explore this question. Do any of these markings resemble Hebrew characters? Well, this marking looks exactly like a Phoenician shin or a Paleo-Hebrew shin. Meanwhile, these two markings resemble a Phoenician or Paleo-Hebrew bet. Meanwhile, these circles look like the Phoenician or Paleo-Hebrew ayin. However, recalling that the original claim was that cursive Hebrew appeared in the pews of this church, let's note instead that those circles resemble the cursive Hebrew samech. So too, these straight lines resemble the cursive Hebrew waw, or vav in modern Israeli Hebrew. That aside, it's also worth noting that in Pastor Richardson's methodology, we don't have to limit ourselves to different types of Hebrew script. Rather, we can also look for symbols that resemble characters from the Ge'ez script.
But they were in awe when I showed some of the letters from the Ge'ez in combination with the Shemitic language. Now, I'm not saying that I can read what's on the pews, but I can identify some of those letters.
So now our thought experiment can incorporate a second question. Do any of these markings resemble characters from the Ge'ez script? Well, these circles certainly look a lot like the Ge'ez ain. Meanwhile, these markings look like the Ge'ez dant. And these two markings look a bit like the Ge'ez Yemen, only facing in the opposite direction. And this character looks a bit like the Ge'ez Gamel, except it's upside down and sort of turned on its side. What's crazy is the very word Ge'ez itself is spelled Gemel Ayin Zeh. So if we already found the first two characters of that word in these markings, then perhaps whoever wrote it was trying to tell us that it's written in Ge'ez. But alas, no, it's just English. It's not Ge'ez and it's not Hebrew. And even if you pointed out that it appeared within a series of columns that move from right to left, just like the Hebrew script, it's still not Hebrew. So what was the point of this short thought experiment? It was done to establish two helpful rules of thumb. First, markings appearing nearby to something organized right to left does not mean that those markings are Hebrew. And second, markings having portions that resemble cursive Hebrew or even Ge'ez characters does not mean that those markings are actually Hebrew. As was noted in previous videos, if one claims discernible, legible language appears in a set of markings, the burden is on them to show strings of characters giving rise to words and phrases. Simply showing portions that resemble characters from a script is not enough. And with that, I hope discussion on what may or may not appear in the pews at the First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia, can continue with a closer look at the markings on those pews. With that said, I'll close here, noting once again that I, as always, look forward to the comments of others. God bless.